this exclusive online exclusive interview, I am here with two hosts of one of the longest-running wrestling talk shows. In fact, it is the longest-running wrestling talk show in the history of wrestling talk shows. I can be talking about none other than Wrestling Talk, and it is celebrating its 25th anniversary. I'm joined by Len Kaplan and Ed Whittier.
Thank you very much, TC.
Yes, thank you, TC. Great to be here.
Longest-running wrestling talk show in television history. Now, Len, you've been with the program the longest. Give us the 411 on how Wrestling Talk started.
Well, Wrestling Talk came about when a friend of mine, Paul Fay, who has since passed away in 1991, came to me one day. I ran a public access studio in the New England area and said, hey, I'm a wrestling photographer now. I can get Killer Kowalski to come in the studio. I said, wow, being a wrestling fan from the 70s, and let's have him on, but I don't know what we're going to put him on because I don't have a show that talks about wrestling, so for lack of a better name, as I said in the first episode, we called it Wrestling Profiles. And we had Walter Killer Kowalski on for an hour in the studio. We didn't know where it was going. And we just interviewed him about stuff that we always wanted to know about him. And that became the basis for our first 5 episodes.
Now, have you always been a lifelong wrestling fan?
Well, I have been since the 70s, actually. I was exposed to it in the 60s by my grandfather. Whenever I would go to visit him, he lived pretty much near the Canadian border, and we would watch Canadian wrestling in French and American wrestling, and we'd see the likes of Edouard Carpentier and Mad Dog Vachon and all the other Vachons. And Andre the Giant had a different name.
Andre
up
Rusinhoff.
Yes, Rusimov.
Yes.
And it didn't really faze me until the early 70s. When I saw Chief Jay Strongbow get turned on by Spiros Arion.
Oh, yeah.
Spiros Arion, the Golden Greek, became the Iron Greek, which became the basis for the famous feud with the Chief, and then he feuded with Bruno Sammartino.
Now, prior to that, Spiros Arion was a face, correct?
Yes, a very big face.
And for those who are listening out
earlier
there,
run.
a baby face is a good guy in wrestling, and a heel is a bad guy in wrestling.
Sorry, TC, we should have informed the audience of that. We got to realize it's not the same audience as we have.
That's
Well,
true.
if you've been watching your show and it's been on for 25 years, I'm sure they've caught it somewhere. I know it's out on YouTube.
Yes.
Now, Ed, how did you get involved with Wrestling Talk?
Well, I, too, was a fan. I'm a fan, of course, product of the 1980s.
That's the era that I grew up in.
Oh, yeah. Hulk Hogan, man. That's what got me going. Hulk Hogan, Roddy Piper, Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff, a lot of the greats. And, of course, I caught the tail end of Bob Backlund and Bruno Sammartino.
And Bob Backlund lost it to my good friend, the Iron Sheik.
Oh, yes. How could I forget the Iron Sheik, one of the all-time greats. But how I got involved with Wrestling Talk was I was actually a fan of the show. And there was
So
an
you had
incident-
one, Len.
Yes.
I was probably the biggest fan, I think, at the time.
Yeah.
And I remember an incident with the Dr. D. David Schultz, and he had attacked Paul Fay, who was taking photographs ringside, and he smashed Paul Fay's camera over Paul's head, split his head wide open, and I was just mesmerized by that, and I bumped into Paul on the street, and I asked him about it. He showed me his scar, and he says, hey, would you like to come back and meet Len? So that's how it all happened, and walked into the studio, and it was just mind-blowing to walk into a television studio and see how they did the show. The set was set up, and I watched them. And then eventually just became a helper on the show and running camera and helping out in the control room and taking phone calls for the live shows, and that's how I started. That's how I started prior to getting on the air.
Mostly, Ed was my research guy because I've never been a real factual Wrestling Talk host. I've always been like having my opinions.
You're like a broadcast journalist. You don't care about the facts.
Exactly.
You were tabloid TV long before tabloid TV, Len.
I guess you could say that.
That's
I guess
a good
you could
point,
say
TC.
that. But Ed was my go-to guy when I wanted to know the names of certain people, when I wanted to know specifically about wrestling belts.
Oh, yeah.
Wrestling is Ed is a wrestling belt person.
A fanatic.
He's
Yes.
a belt mark.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. TC, I'm probably one of the biggest belt marks out there.
Of all the belts in all of the history
Yes.
of professional wrestling, what's your favorite one?
My all-time favorite wrestling belt
Right.
is Hogan. It's called the Hogan 85.
The Hogan 85.
Hogan 85. That would be the belt after the big green belt he won in 1984. They quickly changed from that big green belt to what they call the Hogan 85.
And how long did he have that one for?
And, well, he had that one till about 86, and that's when they changed to they had what they call the Hogan 86, and then they went on to the winged belt.
The wing belt.
Yes, which is also a great one. Of course, better known by Bret the Hitman Hart. It's better known with the wing belt.
Len, what's your favorite wrestling belt of all time?
Probably the Bruno Sammartino belt that he had for 8 years.
Excellent one.
Really?
Yeah.
Mine is, without question, the Intercontinental Championship held by the Macho Man Randy Savage and the Honky Tonk Man.
Now, TC, obviously, if you're still watching to this day, you might have noticed that they have brought a retro type of IC belt back.
I have seen it when I'm flipping through the dials, but it reminds me too much of the Ultimate Warrior belts.
Well, it is colorful.
Yeah.
It has a white strap.
It's not
Yeah.
traditional classic
I
like
agree.
the Intercontinental Championship. You remember the Intercontinental Championship, for those of you who don't watch wrestling now, 20 years ago, the Intercontinental Championship was the most defended championship in all of the WWF.
Yep.
I mean, when you went to the Boston Garden or Madison Square Garden,
Yep.
the main event wasn't always the world's heavyweight champion. It was the Intercontinental Championship.
Absolutely.
Now, I know growing up in New Jersey, I used to go to Madison Square Garden, and I used to come up and visit relatives at the Boston Garden, and you'd see Honky Tonk Man defending against Macho Man Randy Savage, and the place was sold out because the belt meant something, because back then, the characters in wrestling meant more than what they are today.
And why do you think that is, TC?
Because back then, they were given bullet points, and you were a character. You were allowed to express yourself and make your own character. Now, you have a 25-year-old who reads comic books who has no idea about the history of professional wrestling, and it's like a casting couch, general casting. I'm going to make you a superhero from Canada, even though you're a Mexican guy from Florida. It makes absolutely no sense.
I agree. I totally
And
agree.
it's just, I mean, look at perfect example, Stone Cold Steve Austin.
Yes.
Stone Cold Steve Austin, when he was in ECW, Len, you remember this. I remember used to seeing you at the ECW shows all the time. Stone Cold Steve Austin had a persona. He was his own character. Then he came to the WWF, and all of a sudden, he was the ringmaster, monotone, and he had Ted DiBiase speaking for him. That obviously didn't work. Someone behind the scenes obviously watched ECW promos,
Yes.
and thus Stone Cold was allowed to go out there and turn up his own volume and become one of the biggest names in the history of professional wrestling.
Well, we've always said that. We've always said that when you allow the performer to bring the bit of themselves into the character, that's where success seems to come from. And Stone Cold Steve Austin is a classic example of himself with the volume turned up. And that's where he derives his success from. And absolutely.
In the last 20 years, can you give me the top 5 names that have been themselves with the volume turned up that are going to be known 100 years from now? Because in my opinion, the people of the generation today, no one is going to be remembered. Zero. Unless you're a wrestling fan. I'm talking about mainstream people. You walking down the street and you say, I mentioned this name, they know instantaneously what they are, and they know all their catchphrases and their mannerisms. Can you give me 5 names in the last 20 years that can lay claim to that?
Not that would be mainstream. I mean, some that would come to mind would be Eddie Guerrero, Chris Benoit, guys who,
But those are only known in wrestling
that's
circles.
what I mean. I can't.
Somebody who The Rock.
The Rock is
Okay.
one of them.
Okay.
All right.
The movie career helps him, though.
Yep.
But before he was a movie star, everybody knew what I smell what The Rock is cooking
True.
meant.
That's
Yep.
true.
That's
When
true.
his
That's
music
true.
played, the place went crazy. They
Yeah.
knew him. He's one.
Stone Cold Steve Austin.
He's 2.
Yep. Triple H.
No, wouldn't count him. Unless you're a wrestling fan, he's not on the tip of your tongue as a mainstream star. Don't give me any credit. I love Triple H's work, and he respects this business. But I'm talking about someone that instantaneously you go, oh, he's a wrestling superstar.
Okay, how many more do we need?
Well, we have 2. We need 3 more. In the last 20 years.
In the last 20 years. Bret the Hitman Hart? Maybe.
Almost.
He was in Lonesome Dove.
Almost at that level.
Yeah.
Almost that level. The Montreal screw job never happened.
Yeah.
He would have just been lost in the shuffle.
Well, you got to put Hulk Hogan in there.
Hulk Hogan, yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah, of
Hulk
course.
Hogan.
Well, you caught me on the 20-year thing. I was going, but yeah, definitely Hulk Hogan.
Yeah.
There are 2 more names that I can think of, but
All
I want
right.
to see if you
Macho
got.
Man Randy Savage.
He's the 4th one.
Step
course.
into a Slim Jim.
Everybody knows
Yep.
who that guy is. I mean, when
Yeah.
he died a few years ago, it made worldwide news.
Yeah.
And he
It's
died
true.
of a heart attack. It wasn't like the whole Chris Benoit story,
Right,
but it was
exactly.
controversy.
Yeah.
And the last person Who do you think in the last 20 years made an impact on professional wrestling because of his character, because it was himself, but with the volume turned up?
Vince
The
McMahon.
Undertaker.
You got it.
Oh!
Vince
Vince
McMahon.
McMahon.
Yeah.
Those are, in my opinion, those are the
Yeah.
5 names in
Yeah.
the last 20 years
Yeah.
that have made such an impact that 100 years from now, you'll
Yeah.
remember them for what they
Yeah.
were doing.
Sure.
And why? Because they were playing themselves with the volume turned up.
True.
And they had, of course, they had bookers and whatnot saying, this is what I want you to do and whatnot, but they embellished it in their own way.
Yeah.
It's not, it's monkey see, monkey do now, and it's just ridiculous.
Why do you think that this has happened this way? What caused them to not let the performers do what they would come naturally
It's
to do?
plain and simple, what I think, in my opinion. Vince McMahon, we know, is a creative genius. He's created wrestling for what it is, but he always wanted to be, and he said it himself, a movie maker. He's not doing wrestling anymore. He is doing Hollywood. So when he's a mogul, just like the Warner Brothers were 100 years ago. He's the mogul of sports entertainment, and he has his own costume designers, music composers, and of course he's going to have script writers.
But seeing the result of this, I can understand, I think you're right. Seeing the result of this, he must see what we see. Doesn't he see how inferior his characters are now compared to the ones that we just mentioned?
I mean,
How can he
obviously,
not?
the almighty dollar explains it all right
Yeah,
there.
absolutely.
And it's no longer putting asses in seats at house shows. It's rating points.
TC, what's your opinion on what will happen after Vince McMahon dies or after the McMahon family does not own WWE anymore?
Well, I don't think that's ever going to change, the McMahon family not owning World Wrestling Entertainment. What I think is going to happen is that Hunter Hearst Helmsley grew up and was trained by Killer Kowalski, right?
Yes.
In this area, has a huge respect for the past history of professional wrestling. I think what's going to happen is, slowly but surely, they will still keep the wrestling sports entertainment aspect, but then they will also incorporate old school wrestling mentality. Psychology. Can you think of wrestling psychology today? They don't have it anymore.
No,
It's
that-
basically
that is what's lacking.
A feud lasts, it starts today, and then in the next segment it could end. Now I'm going to give you an example of how psychology draws fans. 1987 is when your guy's show started, 25 years
Yeah.
ago. What was the biggest angle in 1987, Ed?
Oh, boy.
Talk about putting me on the spot.
Ah!
You're laughing.
I'm laughing because I'm
Biggest
next.
angle in 1987.
The biggest event of them all.
Wow.
It would have to be WrestleMania.
It would be WrestleMania number 3. And everybody says, what's the greatest match in the history of WrestleMania 3?
Savage and Steamboat.
Savage and
Yeah.
Steamboat did not put 93,000 people in that
Oh,
building.
of course. Hogan and Andre.
Andre and Hogan.
That's
And
right.
What
That's right.
angle set that up? A simple gesture by Andre the Giant,
Yep.
ripping Hulk Hogan's
That's
shirt
right.
and crucifix.
Yeah.
He
Yep.
didn't beat him up. He didn't do
Right.
anything.
That's right.
That emotional effect that he had on the fans, turning on his best friend and aligning himself with Bobby Heenan.
Yeah.
And don't forget, that angle was only done at the end of January, and WrestleMania was in March, so didn't have that long of a build-up.
That's right.
That's how emotionally people were attracted to wrestling back then.
That's a
That
good
a
point.
simple gesture of a shirt being ripped
That's right.
caused 93,000 people to go see that match.
And that's a great point because today you have them trying to put Mark Henry over. And Mark Henry, they have him destroying rings and stuff in the back and throwing stuff and all that
And destroying
motion.
opponent after opponent
Exactly.
after opponent. and
all that
all
motion
for nothing.
does not produce emotion.
No, not at all.
That's true. That is true.
I mean, look at the Big Show. The Big Show could have been the second coming of Andre the Giant.
Yeah.
But the only thing that happened, and Bobby Heenan even said this, he started taking bumps. Andre the Giant never took bumps. He maybe
No.
took a couple little things here and there,
Right.
but nothing. He never got body slammed. He never, all this other
Right.
stuff. He
that's-
was a giant.
That's why it was a big deal when Hulk Hogan body slammed him.
It was a
And-
big
and
deal
I-
for that generation, but it wasn't the
Absolutely.
first time Andre the Giant got body
No,
slammed.
that's true. But I mean, for that generation, for myself growing up, to see Andre the Giant get body slammed by Hulk Hogan was a huge deal.
It
And
was.
It was absolutely a
Also,
huge
how they destroyed the Glamazon character of Beth Phoenix. She was never body slammed or anything. No one could do anything or even move
I think
her.
there's a little bit of big of a difference between her and Andre the Giant.
Right,
Len.
but I'm just comparing it in
Did you
divas.
just put both of those people in the
Well,
same breath?
just in relation to the situation.
It's an
Once
analogy.
they made her more human and able to get bumps,
It's the,
then her character
it's
was
the
ruined.
same with Bill
Yeah.
Goldberg. When they had him
Yeah.
lose, it
Oh,
was
yeah.
over.
Yeah.
That was one of the nails
Yeah.
in WCW's coffin. That guy
Yeah.
could have went on for the next 10 years beating everybody. Look
Yeah.
at Hogan. He
Yeah.
did the same match every time for 10 years.
Yeah.
And guess what? He never lost his credibility.
10 years for 20 years.
But we're talking about
It's
your
true, you're right.
1987, the
Yeah.
year you guys started,
Yeah.
is my all-time favorite year in professional wrestling. You had some of the greatest angles. You're the biggest event,
Yeah.
and it was just a turning point for professional wrestling to become more mainstream
Yeah.
than it ever was before.
absolutely.
I mean, you had the WrestleMania 3 when Andre and Hulk. You had Randy Macho Man Savage turning into becoming the company's biggest babyface,
Yep.
and you had the Honky Tonk Man, who
Oh,
was
yeah.
probably the guy who had the biggest amount of heat in 1987 for the
Yeah.
WWF because he was the Intercontinental Champion. He was an Elvis impersonator. He shoved Elizabeth down and cranked the guitar over Macho Man's head.
Yeah.
I mean, people paid to see stuff like that. You don't have characters like that
That's
anymore.
right. And also
Well-
in 1987, you still had people around like we had on our show in '88. Bruno Sammartino came on our show.
That's right.
And just the aura that he had around him when he came into the studio in our live audience was just incredible. You don't get that today.
Can we blame? I don't want to blame any one organization, but can we blame hardcore wrestling for the demise of the shock value for what you just said? Macho Man Savage getting the guitar over his head and those smaller type angles getting a lot of heat. Can
I
we
would
blame
say yes
hardcore
and
wrestling?
no, but you got to remember, if you had cable television or you were a tape trader back then, a lot of the stuff that you saw in ECW was kind of done in Memphis with Jerry Lawler. For years,
Right.
they did all those angles and stuff down there. I just think that when the 80s ended and the 90s and everything was on TV, the O.J. Simpson thing on TV, society changed, so wrestling had to change. So
Yeah.
ECW, when its early age, from like 1994 until like around 1997,
Yep.
was some of the most innovative stuff you saw on television.
No
I
question.
mean, you got to remember something. Wrestling is a television show. It is episodic television that wants you to come back week in, week out. And they did a hell of a job. The thing that I think made professional wrestling not as credible in people's eyes is they gave away too much. It's like magician. You go see David Copperfield. You know he's not chopping someone in half. You just want to believe that he's doing it.
Right.
And then you have people going around saying, "Oh, well, you know, well, this is how we do it." And that killed it once the magician's tricks were up. Because back then, from the 60s all the way up until, say, like the early 1990s, a word that isn't used that much in professional wrestling
Yes.
anymore was kayfabe.
Yeah.
Because these people had to be these characters 24 hours a day. Even if you saw them in the street, you had to believe that Captain Lou Albano was really crazy like that. You had to believe that Bobby Heenan was really a weasel because it made you think and believe.
Even wrestling itself, in those days, nobody knew one federation from another. All they knew was professional wrestling on television. No one knew WWF. No one knew the Mid-South. No one knew all these territories like the AWA.
Well, I mean, the magic of cable TV changed all of that.
Yeah.
And if you were a fan in 1987, you had a plethora of choices
Oh,
to choose from.
sure did.
You had not only the WWF, you had the NWA, the Jim Crockett promotion show.
Yep.
You had the AWA. You had World Class out of Texas.
Yep.
And you had all these other little renegade groups running around that you
Yep.
could catch on any dial. If you were a wrestling fan in the late 1980s,
Oh, it was great.
it was the greatest time because you had so much to choose from. You didn't just have one show telling you who to like, who not to like. And back then, if a guy didn't like where he was working, he'd show up on the other competitor's TV. And it made it interesting and exciting to follow.
Sure did, and
I-
that was my thing with World Class. World Class Championship Wrestling, actually, for being a small Dallas promotion, actually did shows in New England and did shows in Chicago, and they did shows all over the country, which is crazy when you think about how small that company was, but the impact that it had on cable television, myself included. I was a weekly, Saturday morning world-class viewer. And for 3 to 4 years, when it was really hot, from 84 to about 86, 87, it was the thing to watch. It was my alternative to the WWF.
It was innovative because they had more
Absolutely.
cameras. They had microphones in the ring.
Yes.
They were doing crazy vignettes and whatnot.
Yep.
A lot of things from all these other companies probably watched this stuff and said, "Oh, we can do that too," and blah, blah, blah. But World Class Championship Wrestling innovated. You had probably the biggest rivalry in the history of professional wrestling, still talked about to this day, almost 30 years later, are the Von Erichs against the Freebirds.
Oh, yeah.
You will never, ever, ever, ever have a feud that will last that long.
That was an
Amazing.
emotionally charged feud when the Freebirds hit the arena at the Sportatorium. Those fans wanted to rip those guys apart. And you know what's really crazy is all they had was a piece of rope around the ring. It's no wonder the fans in Dallas didn't jump the rails because the amount of heat that those guys generated with the Von Erichs, who were just
They were
over the
gods.
top loved.
They were gods in Texas.
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, one of the things that I think happens is heels of today, because they're being told what to say and whatnot, are afraid of heat.
Yes.
Back then, I mean, if you were a bad guy in wrestling and you had the most heat on you, you wanted fans to get riled up. Guys back in the 70s, if they were heel, used to carry guns around with them because they were afraid for their lives.
Oh, yeah, many stories about classy Freddie Blassie leaving the Boston Garden, for instance, having his brand new Cadillac have a bunch of dents in the side of it from the fans going nuts as he's driving out of the back of the Boston Garden. I
He
mean,
lost his
these
eye,
things-
too, you know.
That's right.
Yeah.
What was thrown at
A
him?
bottle, I believe.
Yeah,
And you know what proves? That means those guys did their job perfectly.
absolutely.
They wanted to get a rile out of the crowd, and they did it.
Yep.
It's not like today because you don't know who's a good guy, who's a bad guy,
Yeah.
who's a tweener, all this other gray area and whatnot. Back then, it was like the movies.
Right.
It was like the Cowboys and Indians. You knew who the good guy was. You knew who the bad guy was. Use an example from the movie Star Wars. When Darth Vader appeared on screen for the first time, you knew he was a bad guy. Why? Because just the way he looked, the way he talked, the way his deep breath, and his story grew. And they don't do that anymore.
Right.
I think it's a combination of what we said earlier, what you mentioned about ECW and the extreme stuff
Yep.
going to an extreme, but also in 1991 when the steroid story broke, the steroid controversy, and kayfabe was broke, like what you were saying, TC. Once kayfabe was broke, people knew who was on steroids. Also, just lost my train of thought. Go ahead, TC.
But kayfabe wasn't broken on a wrestling show.
Right.
It was in
No.
mainstream news. You didn't
Right.
have them coming out, hey,
Right.
brother, 24-inch pythons, here's
Right.
my needle. No, they didn't talk about that. They were
Right.
still their characters. And you're 12 years old. You could care less who's shooting up juice or anything like that.
Right.
You were still entertained by it.
Right.
It hit the mainstream news, and, of course, adults saw it, and, the kids didn't bring the
Right.
kids anymore. But they weren't actually exposing that on wrestling television.
Right.
It was still, how many soap opera actors are on drugs and whatnot? They don't stop in the middle of the scene and go, I can't do the scene because I'm on coke. No, they don't
Right.
do that.
Right.
They stay in character. And that's what happened is the lost art of professional wrestling. It was, quote unquote, an illusion. And you fell into it. It's like going to a movie. You know Arnold Schwarzenegger isn't killing 15,000 people with a machine gun, but your adrenaline gets so high up that you are excited to see it.
Right.
But
Right.
After that era, when they started to have vignettes in the back and all that stuff, and today with all these wrestlers tweeting, there is a big difference when you see CM Punk tweeting versus when you see CM Punk cutting a promo in the ring, and you know it's fake.
if the WWE spent more time promoting characters as opposed to social media, you'd have more character development and more fans.
Yeah.
Who cares about tweeting? Obviously, these things, too, you know what it says? Oh, trending worldwide. You get 20,000 people in an arena with cell phones tweeting it right now and 4 million people doing it. But how long do those trends last? Minutes? They don't last days.
Exactly.
Right. It's they're looking for the next big thing, and that's the problem.
A
with
tweet now trending is an equivalent to a cheap pop.
Oh, I agree with that. And it's kind of classless, in my opinion, to keep throwing it on the screen every 10 minutes saying, oh, such and such is trending worldwide. Now, we all know that the viewing audience of the World Wrestling Entertainment is huge. There's no doubt about that.
They're the only game in town.
And that's the problem, and we've said this for years. When you take away your competition, you're not as good as you could be. Some of the best times in the WWF or the WWE was when WCW was hot. Not when it was on its downswing, but when it was hot.
Yeah,
when
like
it was
96, 97,
when
98.
they were beating the WWF every single week in the ratings.
Yeah.
And that says a lot when you think of the media machine that Vince McMahon created, and he was being beaten at his own game
He was being beaten
by a
the
virtual unknown.
He was being beaten by the characters he created.
That's absolutely
So it was like
well
Frankenstein's
stated.
monster attacking Dr. Frankenstein.
That's right.
Basically what it was.
That's you're absolutely
But
right.
in the long run, he got the last laugh.
When he bought the when he bought WCW, and he showed up down there in Florida on their TV. I have to admit that was a piece of television history to see that, because it was
for a long time, wrestling fans, it was surreal. But
was.
The people who were
really
just starting
was.
to watch wrestling like a year before, it meant nothing.
Right.
But you got to remember, that isn't the first time he took over Ted Turner's organization.
Oh, that's true.
Because he bought time on TBS in the mid-1980s.
Yes, I remember that.
And he was actually on the old World Championship Wrestling set, the ones that like Tony Schiavone and Jim Ross used to host out of the studio.
Yep.
And Vince McMahon was doing wraparounds, and so was Gorilla Monsoon.
Yep.
That was very surreal. I mean, it wasn't a national product. It was only in Atlanta, and if you had the Superstation at the time, you saw it. But the fans down south was an uproar because they were used to Georgia Championship Wrestling and seeing guys like Ric Flair, Dusty Rhodes, the Andersons, and whatnot. And then all of a sudden, you're just watching squash matches with the Junkyard Dog, Jake the Snake, and all the other stuff. And down there in wrestling originated in the South. I mean, it is huge down there. Always has been, always will be. And when you take away the drama and the passion and the creativity that the NWA was giving their fans down there, and put on these one-sided matches, they were only on the air for less than a year.
Can anything happen outside the WWE to return professional wrestling to a good state?
Can anything change?
Yeah.
No. It's too far gone.
You think it's too far
I think
gone?
If Helmsley does get 100% control after Vince either passes away or retires, like I said earlier, I think he has a respect for the industry and a respect for all the old-timers and the psychology, because he was trained right, that I do see it'll come back. And you can see it now. They're doing more backstage interviews a la Mean Gene Okerlund. They're doing, when a new guy's coming to town, they're doing the vignettes like they used to do in the 80s. So slowly but surely. But you got to get rid of these 30-minute interviews in the ring. No one cares about those things anymore. It's like I would rather watch squash matches again.
Well, one of the points we brought up on our show recently, we talked about squash matches and how on television the WWF would have all squash matches, and you would never see, say, Hulk Hogan, and you mentioned Bruno Sammartino. We would never see him on TV because you waited to go to your local arena to see these people. And then when you got there, you were there, like we said before, for the Hogan-Andre, you were there for the match. Now, when you go to a regular WWE card, it's the same thing you see on Monday nights or Friday nights. It's basically the same thing. And so there's no mystery there. We're going to see and you almost say to yourself, well, why am I here? I can see this at home on television for free. But it's
people
lost.
Still go to it.
No,
people still pay for it.
But it's a different generation, Lynn.
Yeah.
You and I are not necessarily going to go to it.
They don't know any better.
As a young child and a young man, we would go to Boston Garden every single time that we had the time to go.
True.
I mean, to see how many I've lost count of how many times I've seen Hulk Hogan defend his belt in the Boston Garden.
But you didn't see it on television because, example, Hulk Hogan, when he was World Heavyweight Champion in a period of a year, he may have defended the title 3 or 4 times, and those were on Saturday night's main event.
On the main events, you would, not Saturday mornings.
No, Saturday
Never
mornings, you would
saw
just see him do the localized promos. Hey, brother, I'm coming to this arena, that arena, blah, 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 blah. And that's what made you want to go and see it, because you didn't get to see it for free on TV every single week.
It built up a mystique, especially with Bruno.
Yeah.
He never appeared on TV.
Right.